The chandeliers inside the grand assembly rooms burned with the light of 400 candles, each one dripping slow trails of white wax onto brass holders polished to a mirror finish. Music poured from the string quartet perched on the marble balcony above, violins and a cello weaving together something elegant, something expensive, something that did not belong anywhere near a woman like Cora Thorne. She pressed her back against the servants' corridor wall and held her breath as two footmen hurried past, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal glasses. Neither one looked at her. Why would they? She had tucked her wild brown hair under a plain bonnet, thrown a clean apron over her threadbare dress, and carried a wide basket overflowing with arranged posies and cut lavender bundles tied with cheap ribbon. She looked, for all purposes, like one of the dozens of temporary flower girls hired by wealthy hosts to decorate their affairs. She was not hired. She was not invited, and if anyone with authority recognized that fact, she would be thrown into the street before she could sell a single stem. Cora moved quickly through the dim back corridor, her worn leather shoes barely making a sound on the stone floor. The main ballroom lay just ahead, its tall double doors propped open, golden light spilling out like honey across the hallway tiles. She could hear laughter. She could hear the rustle of silk gowns and the confident stamp of polished boots on hardwood. Her stomach twisted with nerves. She had never attempted anything this bold before. For 7 years, she had sold flowers from her corner near the Cheapside Market, arranging penny bundles of daisies and violets for housemaids and shop clerks who could barely spare the coin. But winter had been cruel this year. Her landlord had raised the rent on her cottage for the 3rd time, and the debt collectors who came knocking every month for her dead father's unpaid loans had started arriving twice a week, their patience growing thinner each visit. She needed wealthier customers, and every wealthy person in the capital city was standing inside that ballroom tonight. Cora adjusted the basket on her hip, lifted her chin, and walked through the doors. The ballroom struck her senses all at once. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, painted with pale blue clouds and golden cherubs. Enormous mirrors lined the walls, doubling the crowd and the candlelight until the entire room seemed infinite. Women glided across the floor in gowns of ivory and emerald and deep plum, their necks heavy with pearls and gemstones. Men in dark tailcoats and crisp white cravats stood in clusters, holding glasses of champagne and speaking with the easy confidence of people who had never once worried about where their next meal would come from. Cora felt small, invisible, which for the moment suited her perfectly. She began to move along the edges of the room, offering her little bundles of flowers to passing ladies with a quiet curtsy and a polite smile. A few women stopped, charmed by the fresh lavender and neatly tied posies. Coins dropped into her palm. Real silver coins, more than she would earn in a full week at her market corner. Her confidence grew. She moved deeper into the crowd, weaving between dancing couples and clusters of gossiping matrons. That was when everything went wrong. She did not see the velvet ribbon on the floor. Someone's dress sash, perhaps, or a decoration torn loose from a sleeve. It lay curled across the polished wood like a small, dark snake, and Cora's left foot landed square on top of it. Her shoe slid forward. Her balance vanished. The basket swung wide on her arm, and her body pitched forward with the graceless momentum of someone who had absolutely no chance of catching themselves. She crashed directly into a man's chest. The impact was solid enough to knock the air from her lungs. Her basket tipped, dumping water, flower stems, loose petals, and bits of greenery down the front of a dove-gray silk waistcoat. The sound of the tin water vessel clattering to the floor rang out sharp and loud, cutting through the music like a bell. The string quartet stumbled. Conversations stopped. 100 heads turned toward the source of the commotion, and 100 pairs of eyes found Cora Thorne. Soaked, mortified, clutching a crushed bundle of lilies, pressed against the chest of a man who stood a full head taller than her. She looked up. The face staring down at her was striking in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw set tight with surprise, dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and eyes, pale gray, almost silver in the candlelight, that held the kind of controlled intensity most people associated with thunderstorms watched from a safe distance. Cora recognized him instantly. Everyone in the capital would have. Evander Vance, the Duke of Ashworth, the most reclusive, most talked about, and most unapproachable nobleman in all of England. Her blood went cold. I am so terribly sorry, Your Grace. I lost my footing. The ribbon I did not see. Her words tumbled out in a breathless mess. She tried to step back, but her shoe caught on a fallen flower stem and she stumbled again, catching herself against his arm. His coat sleeve was now stained with greenish water. The crowd around them had gone absolutely silent. She could feel the weight of every stare in the room pressing down on her like a physical thing. 2 guards from the entrance began pushing through the crowd, their expressions hard.
"Remove her," one of them called out. "She is not on the guest list."
Cora's heart hammered. She bent down frantically, grabbing at her scattered flowers and the dented tin. This was it. She would be dragged out, humiliated, probably reported to the constable for trespassing. The debt collectors would hear about it. Her landlord would hear about it. By morning, the last shred of dignity she had been clinging to would be gone. She reached for a crushed rose near the Duke's boot, and as her hand stretched forward, her sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal her right thumb, and the small, unusual scar pressed into the skin there. A star shape, slightly raised, as if burned into her flesh long ago. Wrapped loosely around her wrist was a thin silver pocket chain she always wore, its links old and tarnished. She did not notice the Duke's gaze drop to her hand, but he noticed everything. His grey eyes fixed on that scar with an intensity that wiped every other expression from his face. His lips parted slightly. His posture, already rigid, turned to stone. The guards reached them. One of them gripped the edge of Cora's arm. "Come along, miss. Out you go." Evander raised his hand. The gesture was small, barely more than a lift of his fingers, but it carried the kind of authority that stopped men in their tracks. The guard released Cora's arm immediately and stepped back, as though he had been shoved. The ballroom held its breath. Evander leaned down. His face came close enough to hers that she could smell sandalwood and old paper and something faintly metallic, like ink. His lips stopped inches from her ear. He whispered a single word. "Bravura." The word hit Cora like a bucket of ice water. Her knees nearly buckled. Her fingers went white around the crushed flowers in her grip. She knew that word. She had seen it written in her dead father's hand, scratched into the margins of documents she could never read, stamped into wax seals she could never open. It was the one secret her father had taken to his grave, or so she had believed. How did this man know it? She looked up into the Duke's silver eyes and found no answers there, only a question that mirrored her own, burning with the same desperate, bewildered recognition. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. The music resumed, uncertain and thin. The guards exchanged confused glances, and Cora Thorne, standing in a puddle of spilled flower water in the most important ballroom in England, realized that her life had just cracked wide open. She just did not yet understand what was going to crawl out. Cora did not remember deciding to run. Her body made the choice before her mind caught up, the way a hand pulls itself from a hot stove without waiting for permission. She yanked her arm free from the space between herself and the Duke, clutched her half-empty basket against her ribs, and turned toward the nearest door. The crowd parted around her, partly from surprise, partly from the instinct well-bred people had to avoid touching someone so clearly beneath their station. She kept her head low, her bonnet shielding her face, her ruined shoes slapping against the polished floor with none of the grace that surrounded her. Behind her, she heard a voice, deep, steady, commanding, call out something she could not make out over the roar of blood in her ears. The Duke's voice. She did not stop. She did not look back. The servants' corridor was darker than before. Someone had snuffed 2 of the wall sconces, and the shadows pressed in thick and close. Cora moved through them by memory, counting doorways with her free hand trailing along the cold plaster wall. 3rd door on the left, through the linen storage room, past the kitchen stairs where the cooks were too busy shouting at each other over clattering pots to notice a girl slipping past like smoke. Then she was outside. The rain had started while she was inside the assembly rooms. A proper English downpour, the kind that fell in heavy grey sheets and turned the cobblestones into a shallow river within minutes. It struck Cora's face and soaked through her thin dress before she had taken 5 steps, but she barely felt it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, trapped in a loop around a single word that kept repeating itself behind her eyes like a pulse. Bravura. She walked fast through the narrow lanes behind the grand buildings, past rows of waiting carriages where coachmen huddled under oilskin cloaks and horses stamped their hooves against the wet ground. Gas lamps flickered at the corners, throwing weak orange circles onto the pavement. A few late-night pedestrians hurried past under umbrellas, paying her no attention. A flower girl caught in the rain was hardly a remarkable sight in this city. Her cottage sat on the far eastern edge of the capital, where the neat townhouses and iron-railed squares gave way to crooked lanes and low brick buildings packed close together. It took her almost an hour to walk there. By the time she reached her front door, she was soaked through to the bone and shivering so hard that it took 3 attempts to fit her key into the rusted lock. She stepped inside, bolted the door behind her, and stood dripping in the dark for a long moment before she could bring herself to light the candle on the shelf. The cottage was a single room with a narrow staircase leading up to a cramped sleeping loft. A small iron stove sat cold in the corner. A wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a shelf of chipped crockery made up the kitchen. Bundles of dried flowers hung from the ceiling beams, lavender, rosemary, chamomile, filling the space with a fragrance that had long ago stopped being pleasant to Cora and had simply become the smell of her life. She set her ruined basket on the table and peeled off her soaked bonnet. Water pooled on the stone floor around her feet. She should light the stove. She should change into dry clothes. She should do any of the sensible things a sensible woman would do after walking through a rainstorm for an hour. Instead, she knelt beside the old wooden chest pushed against the far wall. It had belonged to her father, Thomas Thorne. He had died 6 years ago, carried off by a fever that took him in less than a week. Cora had been 22, old enough to understand the debts he left behind, but too young to know how to manage them. The creditors had come within days of his burial, stripping the family home of anything valuable: the furniture, the silver, her mother's jewelry, the books. They would have taken the chest, too, except that it was battered and plain and clearly worth less than the effort of carrying it down the stairs. They had no idea what was inside. Cora lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned in protest, stiff with age. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, lay a stack of yellowed papers, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, the ledger. She pulled it out carefully and held it up to the candlelight. The ledger was thick, bound in dark brown leather that had cracked along the spine with age. Its cover was sealed shut with 3 heavy discs of dark red wax, each one stamped with an intricate design, a star shape surrounded by a ring of tiny symbols she had never been able to identify. The same star shape that was scarred into the pad of her right thumb. She had received that mark when she was 8 years old. She remembered it only in fragments, her father pressing something hot and metal against her thumb while she cried, his voice low and urgent telling her to be brave, promising her it would only hurt for a moment and that one day she would understand why. She never did understand. He never explained. And every time she had asked about the ledger or the star or the word she sometimes saw scrawled in his papers, bravura, he had gone quiet and changed the subject with a firmness that frightened her more than any raised voice ever could. After his death, she had tried everything to open the ledger. She had slid kitchen knives under the wax seals. She had heated them gently over candle flames. She had even taken it to an old locksmith on Fetter Lane, who had turned it over in his hands, frowned at the wax, and told her he would need to break the seals entirely to open it. She had refused. Something deep in her gut told her that breaking those seals would destroy whatever secret they protected. So the ledger had stayed sealed, and Cora had filed it away in the quiet, painful corner of her mind, reserved for things about her father she would never understand. Until tonight. She turned the ledger over in her hands, running her thumb, the scarred one, across the star-shaped wax imprint. The shape matched her scar so precisely that she could press her thumb into the wax and feel every ridgeline up, as though the seal had been made from her own skin. The Duke of Ashworth knew the word bravura, a word she had only ever seen in her father's private writings. A word connected to this sealed ledger, to this strange scar, to a past her father had guarded with a silence so complete it had followed him into his grave. What had her father been involved in? And how was a man like Evander Vance, a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, connected to a dead flower merchant who left nothing behind except debts and secrets? Cora set the ledger on the table and stared at it for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the cottage roof and the occasional rattle of a carriage passing on the lane outside. She had spent 6 years believing her father was simply an unlucky man who had borrowed too much and died too soon. That belief had shaped every day of her life since. Every early morning at the flower market, every skipped meal, every coin scraped together to keep the debt collectors from her door. What if that belief was wrong? The candle on the shelf guttered and spat. Shadows leaped across the walls. Cora wrapped her arms around herself and shivered, though she was no longer sure the cold was to blame. Somewhere across the city, in a ballroom full of light and music, a duke was asking questions about her. She could feel it. Cora woke to the sound of hooves on cobblestone. She had fallen asleep at the table some time before dawn, her head resting on her folded arms beside the sealed ledger. The candle had burned down to a flat pool of cold wax. Grady morning light filtered through the small window above the stove, weak and colorless, the kind of light that promised another overcast English day. The hooves stopped directly outside her cottage. Cora lifted her head, blinking hard. Her neck ached from the awkward angle, and her dress, still damp from last night's rain, clung to her skin in stiff, uncomfortable patches. She pushed the ledger beneath the wool blanket in the chest and closed the lid before crossing to the window. What she saw made her press her hand flat against the cold glass. A carriage stood in the narrow lane outside her door. It was the kind of carriage Cora saw only from a distance, rolling through the broad avenues of Mayfair or lined up outside the Opera House on performance nights. Glossy black lacquer with gold trim along the edges. Brass fittings polished to a warm shine. 4 matched bay horses, their coats gleaming even under the dull sky, stood perfectly still in their harnesses, breath rising in soft white clouds from their nostrils. On the carriage door, painted in gold leaf against a dark green shield, was a coat of arms. A stag standing beneath a crown of oak leaves. She recognized it. Every person in the capital would have recognized it. It was the crest of the House of Ashworth. Her stomach dropped. A figure stepped down from the carriage. He was an older man, perhaps 60, dressed in a sober black coat with silver buttons and a high white collar starched so stiff it looked like it could stand on its own. His hair was white and neatly combed back from a lined, dignified face. He carried a leather folio tucked under one arm and moved with the measured, unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades in service to important people and had absorbed their authority through proximity. He approached her front door and knocked 3 times. The sound was firm, polite, and somehow impossibly loud in the quiet morning lane. Cora looked down at herself. Wrinkled dress, tangled hair falling loose around her shoulders, dark circles under her eyes from a night spent sleeping on a table instead of a bed. She looked like someone who had crawled out of a ditch, which was not terribly far from the truth. She considered pretending she was not home, but the window was small, not small enough to hide behind, and she had the distinct feeling that a man who worked for the Duke of Ashworth was not easily discouraged by a closed door. She pulled her hair back, tucked it under a plain cotton cap from the hook by the door, straightened her dress as much as the wrinkles would allow, and opened the door halfway. The man on her doorstep regarded her with an expression of perfect professional courtesy. If he noticed her disheveled appearance or the modest state of her cottage visible behind her, his face betrayed nothing. "Miss Cora Thorne?" he asked. His voice was smooth and carefully modulated, the kind of voice trained to deliver messages in drawing rooms and dining halls without ever rising above a comfortable volume. "Who is asking?" "My name is Mr. Harding. I serve as head butler to His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth." He offered a slight bow, not deep, but respectful. "I come bearing a personal communication from His Grace, and a small matter of restitution." He opened the leather folio and produced a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark green wax. The same stag and oak crest from the carriage door was pressed into the seal. He held it out to her with both hands, as though it were made of glass. Cora stared at the envelope without taking it. "Restitution for what?" "His Grace was made aware that your wares were damaged during last evening's event at the Assembly Rooms. He wishes to compensate you for the loss." Mr. Harding reached into the folio again and produced a second item, a silver banknote, folded once, tucked inside a smaller envelope of plain white paper. Cora caught a glimpse of the printed figure on the note and felt her mouth go dry. It was more money than she earned in 2 months of selling flowers. "I cannot accept that," she said, though the words scraped against her better judgment like a shoe against gravel. Her rent was overdue. Her flower stock needed replenishing. The debt collectors would return by the end of the week. "His Grace anticipated you might say that," Mr. Harding replied, with the faintest trace of warmth entering his otherwise composed expression. "He instructed me to assure you that the sum is a practical matter of compensation, offered without condition or obligation. He also asked me to convey that the enclosed letter will explain his reasons for requesting your presence at the Ashworth townhouse this afternoon." "My presence?" "At your convenience, Miss Thorne, though His Grace did express a preference for this afternoon, if your schedule permits." Cora almost laughed. Her schedule. As if the Duke imagined she had a calendar full of luncheon appointments and afternoon teas. Her schedule consisted of waking before dawn, hauling buckets of water to keep her flowers fresh, standing on a street corner for 10 hours, and walking home with aching feet and a few shillings in her pocket. She took the envelope. Then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to preserve her pride, she took the banknote as well. "Mr." Harding gave another measured bow. "A carriage will be sent for you at 2:30, should you wish to attend. Good morning, Miss Thorne." He returned to the carriage, climbed up beside the driver, and the 4 bay horses pulled away down the lane with a smooth clatter that drew the faces of 3 neighboring women to their windows. Cora could already imagine the gossip spreading through the lane like spilled ink by lunchtime. She closed the door and leaned against it, pressing the sealed envelope against her chest. For a full minute, she simply stood there, breathing. Then she broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was precise, angular, and surprisingly legible for a nobleman. Most men of rank she had encountered, landlords, solicitors, the occasional magistrate, wrote in a cramped, self-important scrawl designed more to impress than to communicate. This hand was different. Every letter was deliberate, every word chosen with care.
Miss Thorne, I must apologize for the disturbance caused to you at last evening's gathering, and for any alarm my words may have provoked. I recognize that my behavior was abrupt, and that you left under circumstances no guest, invited or otherwise, should endure. I have reason to believe that a matter of considerable importance connects your late father's affairs to my own family's history. This matter concerns a private legal agreement that, if confirmed, could alter the standing of both our houses significantly. The debt on your father's ledger is not what you believe. I ask only for the opportunity to explain what I know and to hear what you may know in return. You are under no obligation to accept. Should you choose to visit, you will be received with the full courtesy of my household and may leave at any moment you wish. Yours respectfully, Evander Vance, Duke of Ashworth. Cora read the letter 3 times. Each reading left her more unsettled than the last. The words were courteous, carefully measured, and restrained in a way that suggested the writer was holding back far more than he was revealing. The debt on your father's ledger is not what you believe. She looked across the room at the old wooden chest where the sealed ledger waited in the dark, wrapped in oilcloth, guarding its secrets beneath 3 discs of red wax. 2:30. She had 5 hours to decide whether to trust a man she had known for exactly 30 seconds, during which she had soaked him with flower water and nearly fallen on his ballroom floor. Cora folded the letter, set it on the table beside the silver banknote, and went upstairs to find a dress that was not ruined. The Ashworth townhouse occupied the entire western corner of Grosvenor Square, a towering limestone building with tall Georgian windows and a black iron railing that ran the length of the pavement like a row of spears standing at attention. Cora had walked past this square before, delivering flower arrangements to the servants' entrances of nearby houses. She had never once imagined walking through the front door of any building on this street. Yet here she was, stepping out of a polished carriage in a borrowed-looking blue cotton dress, the only decent one she owned, with the sealed ledger wrapped in cloth and tucked under her arm. Mr. Harding met her at the entrance and led her through a marble-floored hallway lined with oil portraits of stern-faced men in powdered wigs and dark coats. The house smelled of beeswax polish and old wood, and something faintly floral that Cora identified instinctively as dried jasmine, tucked somewhere out of sight. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet. The house felt enormous and oddly empty, as though it had been built to hold a large family and had long since forgotten what that felt like. They stopped before a heavy oak door on the first floor. Mr. Harding knocked once, opened it, and stepped aside.
Miss Thorne, Your Grace. Cora walked in. The room was a private library, and it was magnificent. Bookshelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling, packed tight with leather-bound volumes in dark reds and greens and browns. A marble fireplace dominated the far wall, a low fire crackling behind an iron grate despite the mild afternoon. 2 deep armchairs faced each other across a Persian rug, and between them sat a low table holding a tea service, white china with a blue pattern, steam curling gently from the pot's spout. Evander Vance stood beside the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the square below. He wore a dark green coat over a cream waistcoat, simpler than last night's attire. Without the ballroom's candlelight and the crowd of admirers surrounding him, he looked different, less imposing, perhaps, more human, though those pale gray eyes still carried the same sharp, searching quality when he turned to face her. Miss Thorne, thank you for coming. Your letter did not leave much room for refusing, Your Grace. A faint crease appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. Please, sit. Mr. Harding has prepared tea, and I have asked that we not be disturbed. Cora sat in the armchair nearest the door,
a deliberate choice that Evander clearly noticed but did not comment on. He took the opposite chair and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The posture was oddly informal for a duke, and Cora was not sure whether it was meant to put her at ease or whether the man simply forgot his own station when his mind was occupied elsewhere. "You brought the ledger," he said, his gaze dropping to the cloth-wrapped parcel on her lap. "I brought it. That does not mean I intend to hand it over. I would not ask you to. I only need to see the wax seals on the cover. May I?" Cora hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the cloth. She held the ledger up so that the 3 red wax seals faced him, keeping the book firmly in her own grip. Evander studied the seals for a long, silent moment. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes, a slow exhale through his nose, as though he was looking at something he had spent years searching for and had half convinced himself did not exist. "The star pattern," he said quietly, "with the ring of maritime compass points around the outer edge. I have seen that design exactly once before in my life, on a document in my father's personal safe." He stood and crossed to a writing desk near the bookshelf. From the top drawer, he withdrew a single sheet of heavy paper, yellowed with age, and brought it back to her. He laid it on the table between them. It was a contract, or rather the final page of one, the signature page. 2 names were written at the bottom in faded black ink. The first read, Lord Frederick Vance, Duke of Ashworth. The second, in a hand that made Cora's throat tighten with sudden, unexpected grief, read, Thomas Thorne, Chief Archivist. Beside each signature was a wax seal, the same star, the same compass ring, identical to the seals on her father's ledger, and beneath the signatures, a single word served as the contract's code name, bravura. Cora stared at her father's handwriting, the familiar, slightly uneven slant of his letters, and felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept carefully sealed shut for 6 years. "Your father," Evander began, and his voice had lost its formal edge, "was not what the world believed him to be." Cora looked up. "The world believed he was a failed merchant who drowned in his own debts." The world was wrong. Evander sat back down, and over the next half hour, in that quiet library with the fire popping softly and the tea growing cold between them, he told Cora the story that her father had never lived long enough to tell her himself. 12 years ago, the Ashworth family's shipping and trade company had been one of the most prosperous in England. Evander's father, Lord Frederick, had built a commercial empire that stretched from the London docks to the ports of India and the Spice Islands. The family's fortune was enormous, their reputation spotless. Then, Lord Frederick discovered that 2 of his most senior bankers were siphoning money from the company's accounts, forging ledgers, diverting shipments, selling cargo under false names, and pocketing the profits. The fraud ran so deep that exposing it through ordinary legal channels would have triggered a public scandal large enough to destroy the Ashworth name entirely and collapse the company overnight, putting hundreds of workers out of employment. So Lord Frederick made a different plan. He hired the one man he trusted completely, a quiet, meticulous clerk named Thomas Thorne, and gave him a secret title, Chief Archivist. Thomas's task was to create a hidden record of the family's true financial holdings, separate from the corrupted official books. Every legitimate asset, every honest transaction, every pound of real profit was catalogued and sealed away in a private ledger, protected by a unique wax stamp that only 2 people possessed. Lord Frederick kept one stamp, Thomas Thorne kept the other. The contract they signed, codenamed Bravura, was a legal instrument that would allow the true ledger to override the falsified records, restoring the Ashworth fortune and proving the banker's fraud, but only when both seals could be presented together before a magistrate. "My father died before the plan could be completed," Evander said. His voice was steady, but his hands, resting on the arms of his chair, had gone rigid. "A riding accident, 3 months after the contract was signed, the corrupt bankers seized their opportunity. They presented their falsified ledgers to the courts, claimed the company was insolvent, and stripped my family of nearly everything. Our trade routes were sold, our ships were auctioned. The Ashworth name became a synonym for failure. He paused.
And your father, Miss Thorne, the one man who could have saved us, who held the true ledger and the matching seal, vanished. Cora's jaw tightened.
He did not vanish. He went home. He sold flowers on street corners and raised his daughter alone and died of a fever in a cottage that was falling apart around him.
I know. I have spent years trying to understand why he never came forward. Why he let himself be buried under debts that were manufactured by those same bankers to keep him silent and discredited. The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage rattled past on the square.
He was protecting me,
Cora said softly.
The realization arrived with the weight of something she had always sensed, but never had the words for. He knew what those men were capable of. If he had stepped forward, they would have come after him. After both of us.
Evander nodded slowly. I believe so. And the scar on your thumb, the star-shaped brand. Your father marked you with his seal stamp. He made you a living signature, the one piece of evidence that could never be stolen, forged, or lost. Cora looked down at the small, raised scar on her right thumb. All those years of wondering, all that quiet, stubborn pain from a father who would not explain. He had been protecting her, and he had been waiting for the right time, a time that never came. So what happens now? She asked.
Evander leaned forward. Now, Miss Thorne, we finish what our fathers started. The old Guild Exchange sat at the heart of the merchant district, a squat, heavy building of dark gray stone that looked as though it had been planted in the earth centuries ago and had simply refused to move for anything built around it. Its facade was blackened with soot from nearby chimneys, and its arched entrance was flanked by 2 carved stone griffins, whose features had been worn smooth by generations of London rain. Cora had passed this building 1,000 times on her way to the flower markets. She had never given it a second glance. It was one of those places that belonged to a world she had no part in, a world of trade licenses and sealed vaults, and men in expensive coats making deals over brandy in private rooms. Now she was walking through its front doors beside the Duke of Ashworth, carrying a dead man's ledger under her arm. The morning was cool and bright, a rare patch of autumn sunshine cutting through the usual grey haze that hung over the city.
Evander had sent his carriage for her at 9 o'clock sharp, and she had been ready and waiting on her doorstep, dressed in the same blue cotton dress, her only respectable option, with her hair pinned neatly beneath a clean bonnet. She had spent the previous evening unable to sleep, lying in her narrow bed in the loft, turning over everything the Duke had told her until the words blurred together and her father's face kept drifting through her thoughts like smoke she could not catch. Chief Archivist, a hidden fortune, a secret contract. Her father, her quiet, tired, ordinary father who smelled of pipe tobacco and knew the Latin name of every flower in England, had been carrying a burden so enormous that it had bent his entire life around it, like a tree growing crooked against a prevailing wind. And she had never known.
Evander led her past the exchange's main trading floor, where clerks sat behind high wooden counters, scratching figures into enormous ledgers, and down a narrow corridor toward the rear of the building. The air grew cooler as they descended a short flight of stone steps. Gas lamps mounted on iron brackets cast a yellowish glow along the passage walls.
The Guild Exchange has maintained private safety vaults since the last century, Evander explained as they walked. Merchants, solicitors, and trade families rent them to store sensitive documents, deeds, and valuables. My father kept a vault here under a private registration.
And you believe the bronze seal stamp is inside?
I know it is. My father's solicitor confirmed the deposit before he retired. The stamp was placed inside the vault along with several supporting documents related to the bravura contract. The difficulty is that the vault requires a specific key to open, a physical bronze key that matches the lock mechanism. They reached a heavy iron door at the end of the corridor. A clerk in a dark coat and spectacles sat behind a small desk beside it, a registry book open in front of him. He looked up as they approached, and his expression changed the moment he recognized Evander.
Your Grace. He stood immediately, nearly knocking his inkwell over. We received your letter this morning. I have located the registration for the vault in question.
And the key? The clerk's face shifted into something uncomfortable. He adjusted his spectacles and opened the registry to a marked page, turning it around so Evander could see. The vault is registered under the name of the late Lord Frederick Vance, as you indicated. It has been undisturbed since the original deposit some 12 years ago. He paused, running his finger along a line of cramped handwriting in the margin. However, the corresponding key was removed from our premises 8 years ago. Cora felt something cold settle in her stomach. Beside her, Evander's jaw tightened.
Removed by whom? By instruction of the estate executor, a Mr. Josiah Pemberton. He transferred the key, along with several other items of personal property, to the Ashworth Country Estate at Highwood Hall, Northumberland. The transfer was conducted under standard protocol, and we have Mr. Pemberton's signature here as confirmation. The clerk pointed to a looping signature at the bottom of the page. Evander stared at it for a long moment, and Cora watched a muscle work in his cheek, the only outward sign of whatever was churning beneath his composed surface. Pemberton, he said quietly. My father's solicitor. He retired to the coast 5 years ago. I was never informed that the key had been moved. I apologize, Your Grace. The transfer was handled through the executor's office directly. There would have been no separate notification sent to the family unless specifically requested. Evander straightened. Can the vault be opened without the key? By a locksmith? Or by your own staff? The clerk shook his head firmly. The vault mechanisms are designed to resist forced entry, Your Grace. Each lock is unique, cast to match a single key. Attempting to open it by other means would risk damaging the contents. We strongly advise against it. They stood in the dim corridor for a moment, the silence thick around them. Cora could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the passage, a slow, steady rhythm, like a clock counting away time they did not have. Highwood Hall, she said.
How far is that? 2 days by carriage, roughly. The estate sits near the Scottish border. Evander turned to her, and she could see him calculating, weighing, measuring the situation the way she imagined he measured everything, carefully and with an awareness of every possible outcome. I have not visited Highwood since my father's death. The house has been maintained by a small staff, but the archives there are extensive. Finding one key among decades of stored belongings will take time. Do we have time? The bravura contract contains a clause requiring validation within a specific legal window. My father's solicitor would have known the exact terms, but I believe we have a matter of weeks, perhaps less, before the contract's enforceability lapses entirely. He paused. If that happens, the document becomes worthless. The banker's records stand as official. My family's reputation remains ruined.
And your father's debts remain on the public record as legitimate.
Cora thought about the debt collectors knocking on her door. She thought about her father's name, written in the defaulters register at the county courthouse, listed alongside gamblers and swindlers, and men who borrowed money with no intention of paying it back. She thought about 6 years of standing behind a flower cart in the freezing cold because the world had decided Thomas Thorne was a failure, and his daughter would inherit that failure like a family heirloom. Then we go to Highwood, she said. Evander studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he seemed to find it. I should warn you, Miss Thorne, this journey will not be comfortable. The roads north are rough this time of year, and the hall itself has not been properly maintained. It is a far cry from Grosvenor Square. Cora almost smiled. Your Grace, I live in a one-room cottage with a leaking roof and a stove that only works when the wind blows from the east. I assure you, my standards for comfort are already well below anything your country estate could disappoint. That crease appeared at the corner of his mouth again, the almost smile she had first seen in the library. "Very well. We leave tomorrow morning, first light. Mr. Harding will arrange provisions for the journey." He glanced down at the ledger in her hands. "Keep that close. Until we recover the seal stamp and present both together to a magistrate, that ledger is the most valuable object either of us possesses." Cora tucked it tighter against her side. She had carried flowers under this arm for 7 years. The ledger was heavier. Everything about this was heavier. The carriage left Grosvenor Square while the city was still wrapped in the blue-gray stillness of early dawn. Lamplighters were making their final rounds, snuffing out the gas flames one by one along the quiet streets. A milk cart rattled past on a nearby lane, the horse's hooves muffled by a thin layer of frost that had settled over the cobblestones during the night. Cora sat on the padded bench inside the carriage, her father's ledger resting on her lap beneath a fold of her traveling cloak. She had packed a small canvas bag with a change of clothes, a comb, a bar of soap wrapped in paper, and the silver banknote the Duke had sent, still unspent, tucked into the lining of the bag where it would not be lost. Her entire life fit inside a bag she could carry with one hand. She tried not to think too hard about what that said about her.
Evander sat across from her, his long legs angled to avoid taking up more than his share of the carriage floor. He wore a dark wool coat over a simple waistcoat, and his boots were sturdy rather than fashionable, the kind meant for country roads, not ballroom floors. He had a leather satchel beside him filled with papers, and he spent the first hour of the journey reading through them in silence, occasionally marking something with a pencil stub he kept in his coat pocket. Cora watched the city slide past through the carriage window. The grand squares and white-fronted townhouses gave way to smaller streets, then to rows of brick workshops and warehouses near the northern edge of the city, then to open fields stretching flat and brown under a pale October sky. Hedgerows lined the road on both sides, their leaves turning gold and copper at the edges. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, exactly, but it had a weight to it. The particular heaviness of two people who had been thrown together by circumstance and had not yet figured out how to speak to each other outside of the specific subject that connected them. It was Evander who broke it first, somewhere past the second coaching inn where they had stopped to change horses. "How long have you been selling flowers?" Cora looked away from the window. 7 years, since my father died." "Did you choose it, or did it choose you?" She considered the question. Most people who asked about her work did so with a tone of pity or faint condescension, the way one might ask a street sweeper whether they enjoyed their broom. Evander's voice carried neither. He sounded like a man who understood what it meant to have your choices made for you by forces beyond your control.
"My father grew flowers," she said, "in the small garden behind our house before the creditors took the house. He taught me which blooms lasted longest after cutting, which ones could survive a cold morning on a market cart, which scents people would pay a little extra for. After he was gone, it was the only trade I had. So I suppose the answer is both. I chose it because it was the only thing left to choose." Evander folded the papers he had been reading and set them aside. "My situation was similar in its own way. After my father's accident and the banker's seizure, I inherited the title and an estate stripped of nearly every asset attached to it. I was 23 years old, standing in the middle of Highwood Hall with empty rooms and account books full of numbers that all pointed downward." He paused, looking out at the passing fields. "I spent the first year convinced I could fix everything through sheer discipline. I wrote letters, I petitioned solicitors, I reviewed every document in my father's study, searching for something, anything, that would explain what had gone wrong." "And did you find anything?" "Fragments, references to a private arrangement, the word bravura, written in my father's hand in the margin of a personal diary. But the contract itself, the page I showed you yesterday, was locked in his personal safe, and it took me 3 years to locate the combination. By then, the trail had gone cold.
Your father had disappeared from every public record. The address listed for him in the contract led to a house that had been sold and occupied by strangers. Cora felt a pang of something she could not quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or the strange ache of realizing that while she had spent years resenting the world for forgetting her father, someone else had spent those same years desperately trying to find him. "I did not know anyone was looking," she said quietly. "You could not have known. Your father covered his tracks thoroughly. I believe he destroyed his correspondence and removed his name from trade directories intentionally. Whatever he was afraid of, he wanted to make certain that no one, including the people who might have helped him, could trace him back to the contract." The carriage rocked gently as the road narrowed and the surface changed from packed gravel to rutted earth. They were well into the countryside now. Rolling green hills dotted with sheep stretched to the horizon. Stone walls divided the land into neat parcels, and farmhouses with smoking chimneys sat in the valleys between them.
"Tell me about him," Evander said. "Your father. What kind of man was he, outside of all this?"
Cora was quiet for a moment. She rarely spoke about her father to anyone. The memories were wrapped in a tenderness she found difficult to share with people who had not earned it. But something about the question, or perhaps something about the way the Duke asked it, with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even himself, made her want to answer.
"He was careful," she said. "Precise with everything. He labeled his seed packets in alphabetical order. He pressed flowers between the pages of books and wrote the date and location where he picked each one. He could tell you the name of a plant by touching its leaves in the dark." She smiled, the expression arriving unexpectedly, like a bird landing on a fence. "He was terrible at cooking, absolutely dreadful. He once burned porridge so badly the pot had to be thrown away. And he sang while he gardened. Old hymns mostly, completely out of tune, loud enough that the neighbor's cat would leave the yard whenever he started." Evander laughed. It was a brief sound, low and genuine, and it changed his face entirely. The sharp lines softened, the guarded quality behind his eyes eased for a moment, replaced by something warmer and more open than Cora had seen from him before. "He sounds like a good man," Evander said. He was. He was a very good man who ended up in a terrible situation.
She looked down at the ledger on her lap, running her scarred thumb along its sealed edge.
"I spent years being angry at him, for the debts, for the secrecy, for leaving me alone with a mess I could not understand. But now that I know what he was carrying, what he sacrificed to keep it hidden..."
She trailed off, pressing her lips together.
"You do not have to forgive everything at once,"
Evander said.
"Understanding why someone did what they did is enough for now. Forgiveness can follow at its own pace."
Cora looked across the carriage at him. The Duke of Ashworth, with his sharp jaw and his careful gray eyes and his decade of solitary burden. He spoke about forgiveness like a man who had spent considerable time negotiating with it himself. The carriage rolled on through the fading afternoon light.
The hills grew steeper, the trees thicker, and the air coming through the window turned cooler and sharper, carrying the clean, earthy scent of moorland and approaching rain. By the time they stopped at a coaching inn for the night, the silence between them had changed. It was lighter now, easier, shaped by the conversation they had shared and the unspoken understanding growing between two people who knew what it meant to carry a weight alone for far too long. Tomorrow they would reach Highwood Hall. Tomorrow the search would begin. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Cora fell asleep without dreading the morning. Highwood Hall emerged from the morning mist like something remembered from a half-forgotten dream. The carriage crested a long, sloping hill, and suddenly, there it was. A vast Elizabethan manor of honey-colored stone, set against a backdrop of dark pine forest and rolling Northumberland moorland. Its many chimneys rose like fingers pointing at the overcast sky, and its tall mullioned windows reflected the grey light with a dull, patient gleam. It was beautiful. It was also clearly suffering. Ivy had crept across the eastern wing in thick, unchecked ropes, swallowing entire window frames. Several roof tiles were missing,
and a section of the stone balustrade along the upper terrace had crumbled, leaving gaps like missing teeth. The gravel drive was patchy with moss and weeds, and the once formal gardens flanking the entrance had gone wild, rose bushes tangling with overgrown box hedges in a slow, green war that neither side was winning. Cora stepped down from the carriage and stood looking up at the house, her breath making small white clouds in the cold morning air.
"You grew up here?"
she asked. Evander climbed down behind her, his boots crunching on the frost-stiffened gravel.
He looked up at the house with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the careful blankness he wore when something stirred an emotion he did not wish to display.
"Until I was 17. After that, I was sent to school, and then to the townhouse in London when I inherited the title." He paused. "I have not been back in 4 years.
A side door opened, and an elderly woman in a plain gray dress and white cap hurried out, wiping her hands on an apron. Behind her came a man of similar age, thin and slightly stooped, wearing a worn tweed jacket. They were Mr. and Mrs. Alcott, the married couple who served as the hall's only remaining staff, caretaker and housekeeper, maintaining the enormous estate with the kind of stubborn devotion that only long-serving country retainers could sustain. Mrs. Alcott fussed over Evander with maternal familiarity, remarking that he looked thinner than last time and that she would prepare a proper meal before anything else happened. Mr.
Alcott shook the Duke's hand with a firm grip and cast a curious but polite glance at Cora, which she met with a small nod. After a brief breakfast of cold ham, bread, and strong tea served in the drafty kitchen, the dining room being too large and too cold to justify heating for 2 people, Evander led Cora through the house toward the basement archives. The interior of Highwood Hall was a museum of faded grandeur. Portraits lined the corridors. Furniture stood beneath dust sheets like pale, shapeless ghosts. The air smelled of old timber and damp plaster, and the faint, sweet decay of a building slowly losing its argument with time. Cora caught glimpses of rooms as they passed. A music room with a covered pianoforte, a drawing room with bare walls where paintings had clearly once hung, a billiard room where the green baize table was buried under stacked wooden crates. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, worn smooth in the center by generations of feet. Evander ducked beneath a low stone lintel and pushed open a heavy door, and the smell that rose up to meet them was thick with age, old paper, leather, mildew, and the cold mineral scent of underground stone. The archive room was larger than Cora had expected. Stone-walled and low-ceilinged, it stretched back into the gloom beyond the reach of the oil lamp Evander carried. Wooden shelving lined every surface, packed with boxes, rolled documents, stacked ledgers, bundled correspondence tied with ribbon, and leather folios stuffed so full their clasps had burst open. A long oak work table ran down the center of the room, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. "My family has occupied Highwood for over 200 years, Evander said, setting the lamp on the table. "And it appears that none of them ever discarded a single piece of paper." Cora looked at the sheer volume of material surrounding them and felt something sink in her chest. Finding one small bronze key in this collection would be like searching for a specific pebble on a riverbed. "Where do we begin?" she asked. Pemberton's transfer record at the Guild Exchange was dated 8 years ago. If he followed protocol, he would have catalogued the key along with the other items he brought from London. Evander moved to the nearest shelf and began pulling down boxes, checking the labels written in faded ink on their sides. "We look for anything marked with Pemberton's name, my father's personal effects, or the bravura code name." They worked through the morning in steady, methodical silence. Cora took one side of the room, while Evander took the other, each of them opening boxes, scanning documents, and setting aside anything that looked promising. The work was slow, dusty, and physically draining.
Cora's fingers turned grey with grime, and her back ached from bending over low shelves.
Several times she found herself sneezing violently from the clouds of dust disturbed by moving boxes that had not been touched in decades. By midday, they had covered perhaps a third of the room. Mrs. Alcott brought down a tray of sandwiches and a pot of tea, which they consumed standing up, neither willing to stop long enough to sit properly. It was early afternoon when Cora found the desk. She had moved past the main shelving into a recessed alcove at the far end of the room, where a large wooden writing desk had been pushed against the wall and half buried behind stacked crates. It was old, older than most of the furniture upstairs, with turned legs and a sloped writing surface scarred with ink stains and ring marks from long vanished cups. She almost walked past it. Then something caught her eye. Along the front edge of the desk, carved into the dark wood with careful, delicate precision, was a border of flowers. Roses, lilies, sprigs of lavender,
tiny leaves curling between the stems. The carving was fine enough that each petal was distinct, each leaf veined with individual lines. Cora froze. She knew this pattern. Her father used to paint the same arrangement on the wooden flower boxes he built for her market cart. Roses on the left, lilies in the center, lavender trailing along the right side. She had watched him do it dozens of times, his steady hand moving the thin brush in clean strokes, while she sat beside him on the kitchen floor, 7 or 8 years old, asking him why the flowers always went in the same order. "Because order is how you keep a secret safe," he had told her once, tapping the side of his nose with a paint-stained finger. She had thought he was joking. Her hands were trembling as she crouched beside the desk and ran her fingers along the carved border. Roses on the left, lilies in the center, lavender on the right. Her fingertip traced the pattern slowly, pressing each carved bloom in the sequence she remembered from childhood. When she pressed the third lavender sprig, something clicked. A section of the desk's front panel shifted inward, revealing a shallow, hidden drawer that slid open with a soft scrape of wood against wood. "Evander," she called. Her voice came out hoarse. He was beside her within moments, the oil lamp held high. They both looked down into the hidden drawer. Lying on a square of dark blue velvet, dull with age but perfectly preserved, was a small bronze key. Its handle was cast in the shape of a star, the same star that marked Cora's thumb, the same star stamped into the wax seals on her father's ledger. Cora lifted the key with shaking fingers. It was heavier than she expected, solid and cold against her palm. "He built this," she whispered. "My father built this hiding place. The flower pattern. It was his design, his signature." Evander stood very still, looking at the key in her hand with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Relief, wonder, and something close to reverence, all held together by the same careful restraint he wore like armor. "Your father," he said quietly, "was extraordinary." Cora closed her fingers around the key and held it tight against her chest. For the first time in 6 years, the weight she carried in that space felt just slightly lighter. The journey back to London took 2 hard days of travel, the carriage rattling south along muddy post roads swollen with autumn rain. Cora kept the bronze key in a small cloth pouch tied around her neck, tucked beneath her dress where it rested against her collarbone, warm from her skin. The ledger stayed wrapped in its oilcloth on her lap, her hands resting on top of it even while she slept. Evander spent much of the return journey composing letters, his pencil scratching steadily against a portable writing board balanced on his knee. He wrote to his solicitor in London, instructing him to prepare the necessary filings. He wrote to the Chief Magistrate's office at the High Court of Chancery, requesting an appointment to present the bravura contract for formal validation. And he wrote a third letter, shorter, more carefully worded, to a barrister named Mr. Whitfield, who Evander described as the sharpest legal mind he trusted and the only man in London who could navigate the Court of Chancery without losing his soul in the process.
They arrived back in the city on a grey Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, the appointment at the High Court had been confirmed for the following day. Cora had never been inside the High Court of Chancery.
She had walked past it many times, the enormous stone building on the north side of Fleet Street, with its columned entrance and wide steps worn smooth by centuries of barristers, petitioners, and clerks, streaming in and out like water through a mill. It was the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small, and it succeeded. She climbed those steps beside a vendor on a cold Saturday morning, wearing a dark green dress that Mrs. Alcott had insisted on lending her before they left Highwood. A dress from the housekeeper's younger years, simple but well made, with a fitted bodice and neat lace collar that gave Cora the appearance of respectability she desperately needed in a place like this. Mr. Whitfield met them in the entrance hall. He was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, with a closely trimmed grey beard and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time reading by candlelight than attending to his wardrobe. He shook Evander's hand briskly, offered Cora a courteous bow, and immediately began reviewing the documents as they walked toward the magistrate's chambers. "The contract page is sound," he said, flipping through the papers Evander had prepared. "2 signatures, 2 seals, witnessed and dated. The ledger, once opened and verified against the seal stamp, should provide the evidentiary foundation we need. The key you recovered strengthens the chain of custody considerably." He glanced at Cora. "Miss Thorne, you may be asked to display the scar on your thumb. The magistrate will want to see the physical correspondence between the wax imprint and the mark." Cora nodded. "I understand. Good. This should be relatively straightforward, assuming no objections are raised." It was the word "assuming" that should have warned them. The chief magistrate's chamber was a panelled room on the 2nd floor, furnished with a long bench of dark wood, behind which sat Sir Rowland Hatch, a stern, white-wigged man with deep-set eyes and a mouth that looked as though it had never once been asked to smile. A clerk sat beside him, quill poised over a document register. 2 court ushers stood near the door. Evander presented the case with calm precision. He laid out the contract page, explained the history of the bravura agreement, described the role of Thomas Thorne as chief archivist, and detailed the recovery of the bronze key from Highwood Hall. Mr. Whitfield supplemented each point with legal citations and procedural references that made the clerk's quill fly across the register. Cora placed the sealed ledger on the magistrate's bench, and when asked, she held up her right thumb so that Sir Rowland could examine the star-shaped scar through a brass magnifying lens he produced from his desk drawer. The magistrate studied the scar, compared it to the wax seals on the ledger, and gave a slow, measured nod. "The correspondence appears genuine," he said. "I am prepared to proceed with formal validation, pending the presentation of the original seal stamp from the Guild Exchange vault and a matching wax impression produced under court supervision. If the impression matches..." The chamber door opened. Every head in the room turned. A man entered with the kind of stride that announced ownership of whatever space he occupied. Broad-shouldered, expensively dressed in a charcoal coat with a burgundy silk cravat, his dark hair oiled flat against his skull. Behind him came a younger man carrying a leather case, clearly a solicitor, and a third man whose plain clothes and watchful eyes marked him as some kind of clerk or assistant. "Sir Rowland," the lead man said, addressing the magistrate with a familiarity that made Cora's skin prickle. "I apologize for the interruption. I have been made aware that proceedings are underway which directly concern the interests of the City Guild Council, of which I serve as chairman." Evander's posture changed. The relaxed confidence he had carried into the room hardened into something rigid and alert, like a fence post being driven into frozen ground. "Alderman Selwick," he said. The name came out flat, stripped of courtesy. The man, Alderman Geoffrey Selwick, turned his oiled head toward Evander and offered a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Your Grace, a pleasure as always." He turned back to the magistrate. "Sir Rowland, the Guild Council has a vested interest in any claims pertaining to former Ashworth trade holdings,
As you know, those holdings were legally transferred to Guild-administered trust following the insolvency proceedings 12 years ago. Any attempt to reverse that transfer on the basis of a previously undisclosed contract raises serious questions of authenticity and standing. Mr. Whitfield stepped forward. The contract is signed, sealed, and dated. Its provenance is well documented. On what grounds does the alderman object? Selwick's solicitor opened his leather case and produced a sheaf of papers, which he handed to the magistrate's clerk.
On several grounds, Selwick said smoothly. First, the original contract was executed between two parties, both now deceased. There are no living witnesses to its signing. Second, the contract references a verification mechanism, namely, a matching wax impression from a specific bronze seal stamp, which has yet to be produced. And third, he paused, letting the silence do its work. The Guild Council's position is that without the original seal stamp being presented and tested against the ledger under controlled conditions, this contract cannot be authenticated. Any claimant could produce a forgery, stamp it with a fabricated seal, and attempt to overturn a lawful insolvency ruling. Cora felt heat rise up her neck. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Whitfield placed a steadying hand on the table in front of her, a small, deliberate gesture that said, clearly and without words, "Not yet."
Sir Rowland studied the papers Selwick's solicitor had provided, his deep-set eyes moving slowly across each line. The chamber was silent, except for the scratch of the clerk's quill and the faint ticking of a bracket clock on the wall. "The alderman raises a procedural point that I cannot dismiss," the magistrate said finally. "The contract's validity hinges upon the physical correspondence between the sealed ledger and the original bronze stamp. Until that stamp is retrieved from the Guild Exchange vault and a supervised wax impression is produced and compared, this court cannot rule on the contract's authenticity." "We have the key," Evander said. "We can open the vault today." "You may, but the Guild Council has requested, and I am granting, formal oversight of the process." Sir Rowland turned his gaze to Cora. "Miss Thorne, Your Grace, you will have 48 hours from the time of this ruling to retrieve the seal stamp from the exchange vault, produce a wax impression under court supervision, and demonstrate a verified match against the sealed ledger." He folded his hands on the bench. "If the impression does not match, or if the stamp cannot be produced within the allotted time, the ledger will be confiscated as potential evidence of fraud. The insolvency ruling will stand, and Mr. Thorne's name will remain on the public record of defaulted debtors, permanently." The bracket clock ticked. Selwick adjusted his cravat with the satisfied calm of a man who had just rearranged the board in his favor. Cora stared at the magistrate's folded hands and felt the bronze key resting against her collarbone like a small, cold heartbeat. 48 hours. They sat in Evander's library that evening, the fire burning low and the tea long since gone cold, and Mr. Whitfield laid out exactly how precarious their situation had become. "Selwick is no fool," the barrister said, pacing slowly beside the bookshelf with his hands clasped behind his back. "He knew about the bravura contract, perhaps not the details, but enough to understand that its validation would threaten everything the Guild Council seized 12 years ago. The trade routes alone are worth a fortune. The warehouses, the shipping contracts, the docking rights, all of it passed into Guild administration after the insolvency ruling. If your claim succeeds, the Council loses everything it built on top of your father's ruin." "Then he has every reason to ensure we fail," Evander said from his armchair. His voice was calm, but his fingers were pressed hard against the leather armrest, the knuckles white. "He does, and the 48-hour window gives him the advantage. He will petition for the most rigorous verification process possible. Multiple witnesses, independent examiners, exact procedural compliance at every step. Any deviation, any irregularity, however minor, and he will move to have the entire claim thrown out." Cora sat in the opposite chair, the ledger on the table in front of her. She had been silent for most of the conversation, listening, absorbing,
turning each piece of information over in her mind the way she turned soil in a flower bed, carefully, looking for what lay beneath the surface. "What exactly does the verification require?" she asked.
Mr. Whitfield stopped pacing and faced her. "The process is specific. You must retrieve the bronze seal stamped from the Guild Exchange vault using the key you recovered. This must be done in the presence of a court-appointed clerk who will document the retrieval. Then, using that stamp, you must produce a fresh wax impression on an official tribunal document, also under supervision. The impression will be compared to the wax seals on your father's ledger by an independent examiner appointed by the magistrate." "And the scar on my thumb?" "Supporting evidence. Compelling, but secondary. The court's primary concern is the physical match between the stamp and the ledger seals. If those correspond exactly, the star pattern, the compass ring, the depth and spacing of the design, then the contract is authenticated. Selwick's objections collapse, and the insolvency ruling is reversed." "And if they do not match?" Evander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then the ledger is confiscated. Miss Thorne's father is formally classified as a debtor in perpetuity, and you, Your Grace, lose any remaining legal claim to the assets your family once held." Mr. Whitfield paused. "I should add that Alderman Selwick will almost certainly have his own examiner present, someone sympathetic to the Guild Council's interests. We must ensure the match is so precise, so undeniable, that even a hostile observer cannot dispute it." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks against the iron grate. Outside the library windows, the city had settled into its evening rhythm. The distant clatter of carriages, the occasional shout of a street vendor closing up for the night, the steady murmur of a metropolis that carried on regardless of the small dramas unfolding within its walls. "When do we go to the exchange?" Cora asked. "Tomorrow night," Evander said. "The magistrate's clerk will meet us at the vault at 8 o'clock. The examination will take place immediately after retrieval, in the exchange's formal witnessing chamber." "Why night?" "Because the exchange closes its public trading floor at 6. The vault rooms are only accessible for private appointments during evening hours, when the building is otherwise empty." He met her eyes across the firelight. "Selwick pushed for the evening appointment specifically. Fewer people present means fewer independent witnesses. It gives his examiner more influence over the proceedings." Cora absorbed this. The shape of what they were facing had become clearer over the past 2 days, and she did not like its outline. Selwick was a man who had spent 12 years profiting from the ruin of 2 families, and he had positioned himself inside the legal machinery with the patience and precision of someone who understood exactly how power worked in this city. He did not need to forge evidence or bribe magistrates. He simply needed to make the verification process difficult enough that one small mistake would give him grounds to shut it down. "There is something else," Mr. Whitfield said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I had my clerk research Alderman Selwick's background this afternoon. He joined the Guild Council 9 years ago, rising to chairman within 3 years. Before that, he worked as a commercial solicitor, specializing in insolvency proceedings." He let the implications settle. "He was involved in the original case," Cora said slowly. "The insolvency ruling against the Ashworth Company." "His name does not appear on the primary filings, but he represented 2 of the creditors who petitioned for the asset seizure. Minor creditors, peripheral to the main case. Enough to give him inside knowledge of the proceedings without drawing attention to his involvement." Evander stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkened square, his reflection ghosting faintly against the glass. "He knew," Evander said. "He knew the insolvency was built on fraud. He saw the opening, positioned himself to benefit, and spent the next decade consolidating control over everything my father built." His voice was quiet, controlled, and utterly cold. "He is not defending the Guild Council's interests. He is defending his own." The room was still.
The clock on the mantelpiece marked the seconds with soft, relentless precision. "What do we need to prepare?" Cora asked. She directed the question at Mr. Whitfield, but her eyes stayed on Evander's back. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, and she recognized it. The posture of someone holding something volatile carefully in place.
"Bring the ledger, bring the key. Wear something presentable. Appearances matter in these proceedings, especially to the examining officials. I will arrange for sealing wax and a heating element to be available at the exchange. The stamp itself should require nothing beyond application to hot wax and a firm, even press." Mr. Whitfield tucked his papers back into his coat. "Miss Thorne, if I may be direct, the impression must be made by you." "By me? Why?" "Because the contract names Thomas Thorne as the custodial party. You are his sole surviving heir and the bearer of the corresponding mark. Having the Duke produce the impression would invite objections about chain of custody. It must be the Thorne line that completes the verification." Cora looked down at her right hand. The star-shaped scar on her thumb caught the firelight, its raised edges casting tiny shadows across her skin. Her father had pressed that mark into her flesh when she was 8 years old, knowing that one day it would matter. Knowing that one day she would need to stand in a room full of powerful men and prove that she was exactly who the contract said she was. He had prepared her for this moment. She simply had not known it until now. "I will be ready," she said. Evander turned from the window. His gray eyes found hers across the room, and something passed between them. An understanding that required no words, built from shared burden and mutual trust, forged over the past week of traveling together, searching together, and facing the steady accumulation of obstacles that the world kept placing in their path. "Tomorrow night, then," he said. Mr. Whitfield picked up his hat from the side table and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at them both. "Get some rest, both of you. Tomorrow will require steady hands and clear heads." He settled his hat on his head. "And, Miss Thorne, when you press that seal, press it firmly. You will only get one chance." The door closed behind him. The fire settled lower in the grate, its embers glowing deep orange in the quiet room. Cora wrapped the ledger in its cloth, held it against her chest, and felt the bronze key resting warm beneath her collar. One chance. She intended to make it count. The old Guild Exchange looked different at night. Without the daytime bustle of clerks and merchants streaming through its arched entrance, the building seemed to draw inward, its dark stone walls absorbing the faint glow of the gas lamps on the street and giving back nothing. The carved griffins flanking the doorway cast long shadows across the pavement, their worn faces taking on a watchful quality in the flickering light. Cora stood on the steps, her hand resting over the small pouch beneath her dress where the bronze key lay against her skin. The ledger was tucked under her arm, wrapped tight in its oilcloth. She wore Mrs. Alcott's green dress again, freshly pressed by Evander's London housekeeper, with a dark wool shawl across her shoulders against the evening chill. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and her hands were steady. She had made certain of that. She had spent the afternoon sitting alone in the guest room at the Ashworth townhouse, practicing the motion, pressing her closed fist down against the table surface with slow, even pressure, imagining the stamp beneath her palm, imagining the hot wax yielding under the star-shaped design. Over and over, until the movement felt as natural as arranging stems in a bouquet. Evander stood beside her, dressed in a dark coat and polished boots. "Mr." Whitfield arrived moments later in a hired cab, carrying his leather case and wearing the same slightly rumpled suit he seemed to own in multiples. They exchanged brief nods. There was little left to say that had not already been said. At precisely 8 o'clock, the exchange's side door opened and a thin man in a black coat emerged, holding a lantern. He introduced himself as Mr. Graves, the court-appointed clerk assigned by Sir Rowland Hatch to oversee the retrieval and verification.
He was a meticulous-looking person, with ink-stained fingers and small, round spectacles that reflected the lantern flame in twin orange circles. "Your Grace, Miss Thorne, Mr. Whitfield." He consulted a pocket watch. "We are expected in the vault chamber. The independent examiner and the Guild Council's representative are already present downstairs." They followed Mr.
Graves through the empty building, their footsteps echoing in corridors that during the day would have been crowded with commerce and conversation. The gas lamps along the walls had been turned to their lowest setting, casting just enough light to navigate by. The trading floor, visible through an open doorway, stretched out dark and cavernous, its long counters standing like rows of empty church pews. The stairs to the vault level were the same narrow stone steps Cora remembered from her first visit with Evander. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying that familiar scent of underground stone and old metal. At the bottom, a heavy iron door stood open, guarded by a uniformed exchange watchman who checked Mr. Graves's credentials before stepping aside. The vault corridor beyond was lit by a row of oil lamps mounted in iron brackets, their flames steady in the still air. Numbered doors lined both sides, each one leading to a private safety vault, each fitted with a unique lock mechanism. They walked in silence until Mr. Graves stopped before a door marked with a small brass plate reading 714. "This is the registered vault," Mr. Graves said, making a note in his ledger. "Miss Thorne, whenever you are ready, you may present the key." Cora reached beneath her collar, untied the cloth pouch, and drew out the bronze key. It lay in her palm, solid and familiar now after days of carrying it close to her body. The star-shaped handle caught the lamplight, each point of the star sharply defined despite its age. She stepped forward and fitted the key into the lock. It slid in with a smooth, precise click, the sound of two pieces meeting that had been designed for each other and had waited 12 years for this reunion. She turned the key clockwise. The lock mechanism engaged with a deep, satisfying thud that she felt through the metal and into her wrist. The vault door swung open. The space inside was small, barely larger than a wardrobe, and lined with dark wood. A single shelf held a rectangular box of polished mahogany, secured with a simple brass clasp. Nothing else. No papers, no additional documents. Just the box, waiting patiently in the dark. Cora lifted the box and carried it to a table that Mr. Graves had prepared further along the corridor. She set it down and opened the clasp. Inside, resting on a bed of deep blue velvet that matched the lining of the hidden drawer at Highwood, lay the bronze seal stamp. It was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 3 inches long, with a turned wooden handle darkened with age and a flat circular base of cast bronze. She lifted it carefully and turned it over. The base bore the design she knew by heart, the star pattern ringed with tiny compass points, every line crisp and sharp, preserved by the airless dark of the vault. She heard Evander exhale slowly beside her. "Mister." Whitfield leaned in to examine the stamp without touching it, his sharp eyes tracing every detail. "It matches the ledger seals," the barrister said quietly, "visually at least, but the formal test remains." Mr. Graves led them to the witnessing chamber, a windowless room at the end of the corridor, furnished with a heavy oak table, 6 chairs, and enough lamplight to read fine print. 2 men were already seated. The first was a gray-haired gentleman introduced as Mr. Dodd, the independent examiner appointed by the magistrate, a retired engraver with 40 years of experience in seal authentication. The second was a younger man with sharp features and an expensive coat, introduced as Mr. Leith, representing the Guild Council and Alderman Selwick's interests. Selwick himself was absent. Cora found his absence more unsettling than his presence would have been.
A man confident enough to send a representative rather than attend himself was a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Mr. Dodd arranged his tools on the table,
a magnifying lens mounted on a brass stand, a set of calipers, and several sheets of clean white paper. Mr. Graves produced a stick of dark red sealing wax and a small brass heating stand with a spirit flame beneath it. "The procedure is as follows," Mr. Graves announced, reading from an official document. "Miss Thorne will heat the sealing wax and apply the bronze stamp to produce a fresh impression on the tribunal verification sheet. Mr. Dodd will then compare the fresh impression to the existing wax seals on the ledger presented by Miss Thorne. If the design, dimensions, and detailing correspond to Mr. Dodd's satisfaction, the seal will be declared authentic, and the bravura contract will be forwarded to the magistrate for formal validation." He looked at Cora over his spectacles.
"Miss Thorne, you may proceed."
The room went quiet. Cora could hear the faint hiss of the spirit flame beneath the heating stand and the soft breathing of 6 men watching her every movement. She picked up the stick of red wax and held its end over the flame. The wax began to soften, its surface turning glossy, then liquid, a slow bead of deep crimson forming at the tip. She tilted the stick and let the molten wax fall onto the center of the white tribunal sheet, pooling into a smooth, round disc the size of a shilling. She picked up the bronze stamp. The wooden handle was cool and dry against her fingers. She positioned the base directly over the wax, took one slow breath, and pressed down. Firm, even, steady. She held the pressure for 5 seconds, then lifted the stamp cleanly away. The impression stared up at her from the paper, a perfect star surrounded by a ring of compass points, every line sharp, every detail exact. She recognized it the way she recognized her own handwriting, the same design that marked the ledger seals, the same design scarred into the pad of her right thumb. Mr. Dodd pulled the tribunal sheet toward him and positioned his magnifying lens over the fresh impression. He examined it in silence for a long moment, then gestured for the ledger. Cora placed it beside the sheet, and the examiner spent several minutes moving his lens back and forth between the fresh wax and the 12-year-old seals, occasionally adjusting his calipers to measure specific points of the design. Mr. Leith watched from across the table, his expression rigid and unreadable. Finally, Mr. Dodd straightened. He removed his magnifying lens, set down his calipers, and folded his hands on the table. "The impressions are identical," he said. "The star geometry, the compass ring spacing, the depth profile of the casting, they correspond in every measurable detail. There is no discrepancy." He turned to Mr.
Graves. "The seal is authentic." Cora felt the air leave her lungs in a rush she had not realized she had been holding. Beside her, Evander's hand found the edge of the table and gripped it, his knuckles briefly white before he released. Mr. Leith opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "I will need to report this finding to Alderman Selwick." "You may report whatever you wish," Mr. Whitfield said, already gathering the documents into his case with brisk efficiency. "The examination is concluded, the finding is on record, and the court-appointed examiner has ruled. The bravura contract will be submitted to Sir Rowland Hatch for formal validation first thing Monday morning." He turned to Cora and offered her a rare, genuine smile. "Well pressed, Miss Thorne." Cora looked down at the bronze stamp still in her hand, its base faintly warm from the wax. 12 years in a locked vault, 8 years waiting for the right key, 6 years carried in the silence of a dead man's secrets. And tonight, in a lamplit room beneath the Guild Exchange, a flower seller's steady hand had brought it home. 3 weeks passed before the letter arrived. Cora was arranging a bucket of late autumn chrysanthemums on her market cart when a boy in a messenger's cap came running down Cheapside, weaving between pedestrians and dodging a slow-moving coal wagon with the practiced agility of someone who spent his days navigating London's crowded streets at speed. He skidded to a stop in front of her cart, breathing hard, and thrust a cream-coloured envelope toward her.
"Miss Thorne? From the High Court of Chancery, miss."
She took the envelope, Her name was written across the front in the precise, formal hand of a court clerk. The seal on the back bore the emblem of the Chief Magistrate's office. She tipped the boy a penny from her apron pocket, set down her cutting shears, and opened the letter with fingers that trembled only slightly.
The language was dense with legal phrasing, the kind of writing designed to make simple things sound complicated and important things sound routine. But the essential facts were clear enough, even to a woman whose education had been limited to what her father could teach her at the kitchen table. The bravura contract had been formally validated by the High Court of Chancery. The insolvency ruling against the Ashworth Trading Company, entered 12 years prior, had been reversed on the grounds that the original proceedings were based on fraudulent financial records. All assets seized under that ruling, including trade routes, warehoused goods, shipping contracts, and docking rights, were to be restored to the Ashworth estate, pending a full accounting by the court's financial officers. The debts registered against the estate of Thomas Thorne had been declared void. His name was to be struck from the public register of defaulted debtors, effective immediately. Furthermore, the sum of £3,200, representing the personal funds seized from Thomas Thorne's accounts at the time of the fraudulent proceedings, was to be restored to his sole surviving heir, Miss Cora Thorne, in full and without condition. Cora read the figure twice, then a third time. £3,200. She earned perhaps £40 in a good year selling flowers. The number on the page represented a lifetime, several lifetimes of security. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it against her chest, and stood very still in the middle of the bustling market while the world carried on around her, entirely unaware that everything had just changed. That evening, a second letter arrived at her cottage, this one bearing the Ashworth Stag and Oak crest. It was brief, written in Evander's angular hand. The conservatory at Highwood is ready for planting. Come and see it. The roses are waiting for someone who knows what to do with them. E.V. She traveled north by mail coach this time, watching the countryside roll past through rain-streaked windows. The journey felt different from the first trip. The same hills, the same stone walls, the same sheep dotting the green fields. But Cora saw them through different eyes. The eyes of a woman who no longer owed anyone anything, whose father's name was clean, whose future, for the first time since she was 22 years old, was genuinely her own to decide. The sensation was so unfamiliar that she spent most of the journey simply sitting with it, turning it over in her mind the way she might examine an unusual flower, studying its shape, testing whether it was real, waiting to see if it would wilt. It did not wilt. Highwood Hall looked different too, though only 3 weeks had passed. The ivy on the eastern wing had been cut back, revealing clean stonework beneath. Several of the missing roof tiles had been replaced. The gravel drive was freshly raked, and the wild rose bushes flanking the entrance had been pruned into something approaching order. Mrs. Alcott met her at the door with a warm embrace that smelled of bread flour and lavender soap, and Mr. Alcott carried her bag upstairs with a quiet nod and the faintest suggestion of a smile beneath his gray mustache. Evander was waiting in the conservatory. The conservatory occupied the entire southern wing of the hall, a long, glass-roofed structure with iron-framed windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, filling the space with pale autumn light. When Cora had last seen it, during their search through the house, it had been empty and neglected, the glass panes clouded with grime, the stone floor scattered with dead leaves. Now it was transformed. The glass had been cleaned until it shone. New wooden planting tables lined both walls, their surfaces bare and ready. Clay pots of various sizes were stacked neatly in the corners. A stone pathway ran down the center, and at the far end, beneath the tallest window, a section of earth had been freshly turned and prepared for planting. Rich, dark soil that Cora could smell from the doorway, loamy and full of promise. And roses. dozens of bare-root rose plants, their thorny stems wrapped in damp burlap, arranged along the tables in neat rows, waiting to be potted and placed and brought to life by hands that understood them. Evander stood beside the prepared earth, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smudge of soil on his forearm that suggested he had been working with his own hands rather than directing someone else's. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Open, unguarded, carrying something close to hope. "You have been busy," Cora said, looking around the conservatory with wide eyes.
"Mr. Olcott deserves most of the credit. I merely pointed at things and asked whether they could be fixed. He did the rest."
Evander wiped his hands on a cloth and walked toward her. "The structure is sound, the glass holds heat well enough for winter growing, and the soil here is excellent. Mr. Olcott has been composting behind the kitchen garden for years, apparently waiting for someone to find a use for it." Cora crouched beside one of the rose plants, lifting a burlap-wrapped root ball and examining it with practiced fingers. Strong roots, healthy canes, good stock, carefully selected. "These are damask roses," she said. "And those along the far table, are those bourbon varieties?" "I confess I purchased them based on the nurseryman's recommendation rather than any personal knowledge. He seemed alarmed when I told him I could not tell the difference between a rose and a peony." Cora laughed. The sound came out easy and unforced, filling the glass-walled space with a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. She stood and turned to face him. He was close, closer than the careful distance he usually maintained, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his gray eyes, earned from years of carrying a weight that was only now beginning to lift. "I received the court's letter this morning," she said. "My father's name is cleared. The funds are to be restored." "I know. Mr. Whitfield sent word yesterday. Selwick's position on the Guild Council is under formal review. The magistrate has ordered a full investigation into the original insolvency proceedings." He paused. "Your father would be proud of you, Cora." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She noticed, and he knew she noticed, and neither of them looked away. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out on his open palm. It was a ring, a signet ring, newly forged, its surface gleaming with the warm luster of freshly worked gold. Set into its flat face was a design she recognized instantly, the star pattern, rendered in fine engraving, surrounded by a border of tiny flowers, roses, lilies, lavender. Her father's pattern, married to the bravura seal, combined into something entirely new. "This is a partnership ring," Evander said. "A proposal, though perhaps not the kind society expects. I am proposing a genuine partnership, Cora. Equal standing, equal ownership of everything we have reclaimed together. This conservatory, this estate, the restored holdings, they belong to both our families. They always did." He met her eyes with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. "And if, in time, the partnership grows into something more, I would welcome that. But I will not presume. You have spent too many years having your choices made for you by circumstances beyond your control. This choice is yours." Cora looked at the ring on his palm. She looked at the conservatory around her, the clean glass, the waiting soil, the roses ready to be planted. She thought of her father, pressing a hot seal into the thumb of an 8-year-old girl, whispering to her to be brave. She thought of a ruined basket of flowers on a ballroom floor, and a single whispered word that had cracked her life open and let the light pour in. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Equal partners," she said. Evander smiled, a full, unguarded smile that reached his eyes and softened every sharp line in his face. Outside the conservatory windows, the Northumberland hills stretched away under a clearing sky, the last clouds of autumn pulling apart to reveal wide patches of pale blue.
A blackbird sang somewhere in the garden. The afternoon light poured through the glass and fell across the planting tables, the dark soil, and two people standing side by side among the roses, ready to begin.